Hello and welcome to podcast.init, the podcast about Python and the people who make it great. I would like to thank everyone who has donated to the show. Your contributions help us make the show sustainable. You need a place to run your awesome new Python apps, so check out our sponsor Linode at linode.com/podcastinit and get a $20 credit to try out their fast and reliable Linux virtual servers for your next project. You want to make sure your apps are error-free, so give our next sponsor Rollbar a look. Rollbar is a service for tracking and aggregating your application errors so that you can find and fix the bugs in your application before your users notice they exist. Use the link rollbar.com/podcastinit to get 90 days and 300,000 errors tracked for free on their Bootstrap plan. You can also visit our site at pythonpodcast.com to subscribe to our show, sign up for our newsletter, read the show notes, and get in touch. And by leaving a review on iTunes or Google Play Music, it becomes easier for other people to find us. You can also join our community at discourse.pythonpodcast.com to help us grow and connect our wonderful audience. Your hosts as usual are Tobias, Macey, and Patti, and today we're interviewing Kyle Martin about his project Podbuzz. So Kyle, could you please introduce yourself?
Hey, sure. So I'm an iOS software engineer at a company called Super Shuttle. It's a service that's been around a lot longer than Uber, but we specialize in scheduled rides to the airport and back. I'm the lead iOS engineer on the driver operations app. So you can kind of think of that of like Uber's driver app, but it's a little bit more complicated from a business operations point of view.
So how did you get into Python?
I started playing with Python in college. I was studying electrical engineering at the time, and I didn't really like the syntax of VHDL. For those that don't know, that's a hardware description language. It's kind of like code that you can write that describes how hardware should behave. And when you compile it, or what's called synthesize it, it will output logical gates that is actually hardware. So I really didn't like the syntax of VHDL. I came from a C Java background, so I looked at Python. It seemed interesting to me. It seemed very straightforward. So I decided to kind of embark on a little project. What I did is I basically made a transpiler. At the time, I didn't know even what a transpiler was, or even if one had existed. But I kind of said to myself, well, I don't like how VHDL is, so I'm going to write my own syntax for it. So I wrote a Python script that would basically interpret my version of VHDL and then transpile it into true VHDL. And then I would paste that into Xilinx and then complete my project for my course in college. My other experience with Python was when I was taking a graduate course. It was sort of an unofficial course. I was an undergrad, but I was really interested in the topic of computational electromagnetics. And I had talked to my professor about it, and he said, well, why don't you just come join us and do a little bit of research with us. So I joined them, and my professor was studying computational electromagnetics from the point of view of how it behaves on the human body. Particularly in medical devices. So we were using MATLAB, and again, coming from a Java background, I really didn't like the syntax of MATLAB. I felt that it was not really for me. So I convinced my professor to let me work in Python. So we implemented a lot of interesting algorithms, just something called like particle swarm optimization and simulated annealing and some other things. Yeah, I really liked that, studying electromagnetics and getting a chance to kind of play around with Python and solve some cool problems with that.
Yeah, those sounds like some pretty interesting projects, and I can remember trying to battle with VHDL when I was dealing with it, so having a different syntax to work with would have been nice.
Yeah, certainly. Maybe just some curly braces, would make it a lot more familiar.
Yeah, Boolean algebra is not exactly the most intuitive thing when you're trying to figure out how to parse that into logic gates.
Yeah, certainly not.
And so you ended up using Python to start a side project that you called Podbuzz. So could you explain a bit about what that is?
Sure. Yeah, so Podbuzz is essentially a iTunes review aggregator. One thing that I found really interesting about podcasting and iTunes is when you're looking at your reviews on the iTunes page, you actually only see your reviews in the country that iTunes is configured in. So if you're in the US, you only see US reviews about your podcast. But it turns out there's 158 other countries. So I was just talking to a lot of podcasters. I have some friends that podcast, and it seemed like that was one of their pain points. So I thought it would be a cool project just to, write a tool that would aggregate all of those reviews from every country and then throw it into a nice dashboard and then let podcasters sort of see where they can improve. And also just, it's really good and really fulfilling to get feedback from your listeners. So it just seemed like a kind of an interesting project to me.
So can you explain why you ended up choosing Python as the language for building the Podbuzz service?
Yeah, I was looking for something simple and straightforward and most importantly, no magic. I looked at other frameworks, Ruby on Rails and some others, and I liked Python and I wanted something simple. So I went with Flask. The whole app is implemented in Flask with the blueprint pattern. And I just also wanted to learn more of the DevOps side of things. So going with Python, it seemed like a natural choice considering that a lot of DevOps tools are also written in Python.
And what have been some of the biggest engineering challenges that you've had to tackle in the process of building your platform?
So one of the things was basically scaling. I mean, I have about 800 podcasters now, and I scrape 158 countries for every podcast every day, and not just scraping data and seeing what's new. It's also running a custom significant phrase extraction algorithm. You can kind of think of that like Yelp. So I really admired how Yelp basically extracted useful information for restaurants and other businesses, and I wanted to provide that same thing to podcasters so they can kind of just get an overall sense of what are they doing right, and then what are they, how can they improve? So it was just was just sort of an interesting problem for me to look into and learn from. So really it was just, how do I get this thing stable in production? And how do I build something that's scalable and is fast? So that's probably the gist of it. Also, I really liked learning Docker. I just used this as an opportunity to learn Docker and figuring out how to set up a smooth deployment process. So I literally have a command on my local machine where I can just type in deploy, and it will look for changes in my Git repo, notice which the code that was changed. It'll notice how that maps to a certain containers that I have in my production environment, and it'll deploy those new containers out into production. So if not, if anything, this project has been more or less just a way to learn new techniques and sort of like modern development skills.
And are you running those Docker containers on any of the schedulers like Kubernetes or Mesos or anything like that?
It's just I have 5 containers and they're just on a single DigitalOcean box. I will get to a point where I need to basically use Docker Swarm to move out to more, move the workers off of one single machine and into, several machines.
I think it's really interesting how the whole containerization revolution has really simplified the process of configuration management and deployment for a lot of people. Can you give us, so maybe a Dockerized view, like what are the components of your system and how did they come together to make Podbuzz work?
Okay, so I have one Docker container that just is a web server. It has Nginx, and then it reverse proxies to Gunnycorn, which is running the Flask web server app. And then I have a couple workers. I have an email worker, so every night I will look for new reviews in the database, and then I'll loop through and simply email each podcaster that has new reviews. And I'll say, hey, you got 2 new reviews, and here they are. It's very straightforward for them, and they actually probably never need to go back to the app at this point. So I have an email worker. I have a scheduler, which schedules the scraping workers to kick off at noon every day. That was pretty much an arbitrary choice of time. It just kind of worked out with my schedule so I could check in production once in a while to make sure everything was running. I have a couple other workers. I have what's called a media worker. That is basically something that will generate videos and do some other interesting things with audio and video. That's actually for some features that I'm working on and are in beta right now. So I have several workers and then a web server, and I'm trying to think of anything else.
That's fine. I mean, feel free to, if you have additional details, but I was just curious about sort of like a component level view. When you say workers, are those salary workers?
That's exactly right. Yeah, they're salary workers, and then the work queue is actually on MongoDB. So I'm using a free service called Mongo Lab, which offers a pretty generous free plan. It's 500 megabytes, and that's where everything in my database is stored. And I also use that as a way to persist the queue. Perhaps not the most efficient or real-time solution, but for what I'm doing, it works perfectly fine. So I'd highly recommend Mongo Lab, or I think they've even changed their name to MLab now. And yeah, so I'm using Celery workers, and nothing too crazy there. Just a Celery heartbeat scheduler that kicks off the emails every night, and it also kicks off the scraping. And then any one-off things, like for instance, when you sign up for the service, I ask you for your podcast iTunes URL. So you put that in, and then I will kick off a one-off Celery job to just pull in all those reviews from all the countries, and then it sends you an email when it's done with all the reviews.
And so it's definitely an interesting project and an interesting problem space, but what made you want to provide it as a service as opposed to just releasing it as a set of tools that people could run on their own?
The first thing is, I mean, most podcasters aren't that tech savvy. They are very competent computer users, but I wouldn't say they're not necessarily going to download an open source project and set it up. They much rather use something that's just sort of free and does something cool for them. So the other thing is I've been listening to a lot of bootstrapped software entrepreneur podcasts, things like Zero to Scale is a great podcast, and also Startups for the Rest of Us is probably the most popular one. So those really inspired me to go with something that I could just, potentially monetize in the future. Right now, my strategy is just to be free and have a tool that's basically better than any other podcast tool out there, and learn from the people in the community, and then eventually move into more of a monetized podcast tool. So yeah, I mean, I just love podcasts, and I wanted to get into the industry. So it seems like a good way to get started. I know how to write code, and yeah, I just wanted to pretty much get into the industry.
And another part of the service that you're offering is a widget that people can place on their websites that encourages people visiting the page and listeners to rate the podcast in iTunes. So I'm wondering if you can dig into a bit why iTunes ratings are important for podcasts to be able to gain visibility, and some of the other goals that podcasters might be looking to attain with their show. Okay.
Well, before I answer that, first thing you need to do is stop and go rate this podcast right now. It's that important. And the reason is iTunes uses the amount of reviews and the rate, the acceleration at which you're getting reviews in order to determine your ranking. So if you get a lot of reviews at once, that's very good for your visibility inside of iTunes. The other thing is if you like the show, then you should leave some feedback and let them know what they're doing right and how can they improve. This is a very asynchronous process, so it's something that I see is very important. And just like you like getting feedback, podcasters love getting feedback, and it keeps them going.
Yeah, to add to that a bit too, iTunes is still largely the backbone of the entire podcast infrastructure, where they serve as the location that a lot of other podcast applications will pull their feeds of, all the episodes that are available for a given show, and the ranking that iTunes provides for a given podcast will also reflect in a lot of the other services and podcast apps that you view. So when you're looking at, new and noteworthy or top trending podcasts, the number of iTunes reviews that you get is one of the key indicators of what will cause a podcast to end up in one of those top ranked lists, so that other people will find them if they're not directly looking for your show in particular. So in order to be able to grow your audience, having a lot of reviews, like you said, particularly in a short time frame, will allow a podcast to hit that top ranking so that other people will be able to see it if they're just browsing through looking for something new to add to their subscriptions.
That's right. And also reviews provide social proof. So if you're not sure about a podcast, you're on the fence, and you see a lot of good feedback, that's going to make someone want to listen a lot more.
Speaking of which, our rating on iTunes is unfortunately kind of not amazing. And part of that is our own fault. When we first started out, we had a lot of audio problems, and I think a lot of people reviewed us back then, and we haven't had a lot of people reviewing us recently. So if you like the show and would be willing to, that would be fantastic. We really appreciate it. And especially if you like the show but reviewed us early on when our audio was terrible, and hopefully you think it's gotten better. We've worked really hard to make that happen. Maybe consider dropping us a new review, and we'll see what we can do about that rating.
So you mentioned that you have some additional features that you're looking to add to the service. I don't know if you are at a point where you can discuss some of them or talk about what you're hoping to grow your service into.
Yeah, a lot of these things I'm going to share are already developed. I'm just getting ready to launch an email campaign for all my beta testers to get them in and test out the tools, kick the tires, and see how it can help them grow their audience. The first tool is like an iTunes SEO inspector, if you will. So you can basically type in your podcast or paste in your iTunes URL, and then it will sort of reverse engineer what keywords your podcast is ranking well for. I spent a considerable amount of time trying to figure out what iTunes uses to rank. What are they keying off of? And then also looking at like other similar podcasts to see, just pulling a lot of data to just figure out what keywords would be best for you to rank for. So yeah, I basically have a tool that will rank, that will basically it's an iTunes SEO tool that can track where your podcast ranks in iTunes for a particular keyword. There's lots of these type of tools for Google. So, if you're a donut shop, you want to rank for the word donut in your city. So you could type in the word donut and Austin, Texas, and then it would basically tell you, oh, you're number 3 when you're the third listing on Google when someone types that in Austin, Texas. I noticed there's nothing like that for iTunes, and I think that's something that could be addressed. So for instance, this podcast, it would probably be Python or developer or engineering. Like any of those words would be very good words to basically put into Podbuzz and then let the tool basically track your ranking over time. It will also basically reverse engineer what keywords other podcasters are using. So maybe there's a podcast that's also about Python, and maybe if you research them, you could basically figure out what keywords they're ranking well for. And if there's something that if there's a keyword that you're not using, it might be a good idea to also use that keyword. So I have that tool, and then I also have another tool that it basically generates a shareable video from clips of your podcast. So you basically can upload an MP3, and then it basically shows you a waveform of your MP3, and you can select sections on a web GUI tool, and you can type in some text for a caption, and what it'll do is it'll basically generate a video of a waveform of the slice of the MP3 that you selected, and it'll throw that text on there, and you can share it on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube. For those of you that are familiar with Canva, it's sort of like that, but it's more for video. And I've noticed there's some people doing this that are like in the public radio space that sort of have this in it. They seem to get really good engagement numbers. So I figure, why not offer this to just the normal podcaster, if you will. Also, I think a tool that might be useful is something kind of like Calendly, which, if you don't know, it's a tool that allows you to sort of fix the process of figuring out how to schedule a meeting with someone. You can basically send them a link, and then they can see the times at which you're available, and they just select the time that works for both of you. And then Calendly will basically remind both people that are in the meeting, or if there's multiple people will get this email. And it's just a very useful tool. You don't have to, it saves basically all the time that you would have to go back and forth. So I'm kind of making a tool that's just for podcasters. So you can basically find people to interview on your show. You can use it to book, basically schedule time with them. It'll basically send automated emails with, instructions on how your podcast is run, what info you need from them. Do you need a headshot? So it's really taking like a kind of a general software as a service product and niching it down into a problem that's like really something that podcasters may want to use. So that's kind of my approach on the features that I'm building. I think I once heard a phrase on the Internet Business Mastery podcast. I think that's what it's called. They basically have this phrase that goes rip, pivot, and jam. So you look at an idea you look at something that's already out there on the internet. It could be a service, it could be a project, or whatever it is. You kind of look at it and you say, how can this apply to something I'm interested in? I was interested in a podcast, and I've seen review aggregator tools out there for Yelp. So I said, okay, I'm going to rip that. I'm going to pivot it toward podcasters, and then I'm going to jam it into the market. And it seemed to work. So if you're ever, thinking, oh man, I wish I had a side project, or I wish there was a way I could take my skills and then turn it into something that would, provide sort of a side business or a side income. That's a really interesting strategy I've come across.
And particularly given the fact that you're choosing podcasters as your niche and your target audience, it sort of validates the fact that podcasting has become one of the big new media trends that's driving a lot of innovation and interest, even from larger media companies. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts or feelings on what is contributing to that popularity.
Oh, the serial podcast for sure. It's pretty much, so the main demographic of podcasts, essentially white males that have gone to college, and that number is not decreasing, it's increasing. Obviously, people seem to think that's the right path to take nowadays, but I guess the real reason is it's just a really good medium. And Alex Bloomberg actually covered this sort of pretty well in his keynote talk at Podcast Movement this year. And I believe he was basically trying to communicate that radio has been a lost art. Before TV, radio was the big thing. And people would tune in every night and listen to these really compelling stories, these mystery stories and news stories and all sorts of things. And when TV came along, it really kind of stunted the innovation and the creativity of the medium. So now that podcast has sort of emerged, what's happened is just like YouTube, it's provided a way for people that have ideas and thoughts and something to talk about. They basically are empowered to create these, works of art and then distribute them without any sort of big media company involved. There's no middleman. Whatever you want to say, you can put it out there. So I think, there's always a podcast for someone. No matter what you're interested in, there's something out there. And I think people are just, they're just discovering that whatever they're interested in, they can find it and get involved in that community. So I would probably say it's mostly the opportunity to connect with people that you wouldn't necessarily be able to find a community for.
I think another thing that's contributing to it as well is that the overall infrastructure and process of producing, but also more importantly, consuming podcasts has become a lot easier than when they first became a thing, where you had to have an MP3 player that you could download the media onto your computer and then sync to the MP3 player if you wanted to listen to it away from your desk. And now with the ubiquity of smartphones and tablets and apps that allow you to just automatically download that media to your device, it makes it a much lower barrier to entry and much less friction And it also plays into the modern lifestyle of people being able to consume the content that they want when they want, rather than being tied to a particular broadcaster and their time that they release. So I know that a lot of particularly radio shows will also produce a podcast version of the same thing, so that if you don't catch it at the time when it's aired, then you can just listen to it when it's convenient for you.
Absolutely. This American Life is a perfect example of that.
Yeah, I listen to Wait, Don't Tell Me as a podcast every week because I'm usually not able to catch it at 11 in the morning on a Saturday when it's aired, but I can download it and listen to it on my way to work.
Yeah, definitely.
And in addition to the work that you've been doing with Podbuzz for being able to increase the number of reviews and overall visibility of a podcast, you're also working on launching another product called Castalytics for being able to track the metrics associated with the podcast. I don't know if you can dig a bit into what kinds of metrics are important and a little bit of the background of the platform that you're trying to build out.
It's interesting you brought that up because that's actually what I ventured out to build at first. And then I pivoted away from that to Podbuzz. And in fact, I actually took down the website, the DigitalOcean droplet, I think probably the same day you signed up, probably hours before, but I hadn't seen that email that you signed up for the email list. But I guess the Castalytics, the original idea is there's basically a lack of analytics, and especially granular analytics in podcasting. No one knows really how many people are listening. You only kind of know how many people have downloaded your MP3. No one really knows how many people listen to the whole episode, or when people stop listening to the episode. So, for instance, YouTube creators, they don't have that problem. They can see exactly where their content is falling short and do something about it. They can not do that kind of that video again, that type of video, or not discuss that topic. And overall, it just allows them to kind of better tailor their content to the audience they're trying to reach. And that's something that podcasters need as well. Or at least that's what I thought. And I still do think that. However, there's a serious technical problem with providing that sort of analytical data. People download podcasts over HTTP. HTTP wasn't designed with analytics in mind. It was designed very practically by engineers. So the problem is that the majority of people that download podcasts, or they download on their iPhone or their Android phone. The root of the problem is that podcast apps download in chunks. So they use the HTTP byte offset mechanism. So imagine you having a very, antiquated Android phone that's on a 2G connection. It's going to be downloading a podcast over probably a day or something, like if it's downloading in the background, and it's going to be downloading in very, very small chunks. That basically makes it pretty hard to figure out if it's one person downloading the file or if it's like 10 people downloading the file, because they could be switching from Wi-Fi to a cellular network, to a hotspot, to, whatever. So you can't really key off of, like an IP address. You need something a little bit more static, like obviously MAC address would be useful, but you can't, that's also not really something you can always do or rely on. Yeah, I mean, there's like kind of a couple questions that podcasters want answered. It's sort of, are people liking my content? Where are they getting bored? Where are they getting excited? And are they listening to my ads? Because it's really important that obviously you're providing value to your sponsors. So those kind of questions are pretty compelling from a business point of view, or from just supporting your podcast point of view. So really the only way that I've found to get that data is to basically use a heartbeating technique. So unfortunately, that's only possible on a web browser or through an app where you can have some sort of mechanism that's playing back the audio. It will take note of when you're playing and pausing and skipping or reversing through, going backwards and re-listening to something. So you need basically a custom podcast player to track those metrics. And I've reached out to a couple different podcast app engineers or podcast app creators, Overcast and Downcast, and they don't seem very interested in that. And I don't blame them one bit, because they, want their users to trust them. And I'm sure most people would feel kind of violated if their there was analytics being collected and sold to someone else really without their permission. It's just a lot of people are security minded and privacy minded nowadays. So yeah, so really if you were wanting to solve this problem, I would suggest making a podcast web player that would be embeddable, via WordPress or just maybe some sort of JavaScript snippet that a podcaster could paste on their website, and that would basically play the podcasts, and you could then relay those analytic points back to someplace that you've set up. Sort of interesting, but I'm not sure anyone's going to solve it anytime soon because of just how HTTP is built.
Yeah, it's kind of the catch-22 of the medium and its popularity, and that part of the reason that it scales and is able to grow so well is because of the fact that it's so open, where you just have an audio file that somebody downloads and they listen to, and then they can redistribute that to other people. So that makes it easier to grow organically, but it also means that you don't have any great insight into what your growth looks like or what your audience looks like and things like that. So it prevents a lot of the traditional business models where you do, for instance, like a pay-per-click, because there's no way to create an analog of a click when you're dealing with audio and freely distributed audio at that, unless you, like you said, wanted to restrict your playback to a medium that you control, whether it's by a custom mobile application or a web player, and essentially adding DRM to it, which is somewhat anathema to a lot of particularly independent podcasters, though there have been some recent moves in the space, particularly with Stitcher, to go that direction, where you control the entire distribution channel end to end in order to be able to get that analytics feedback so that the advertisers and bigger companies can monetize podcasts.
That's right. There's actually one instance that I know of in particular that is doing this, and that's NPR. They have an app called NPR One, and they are seriously tracking everything you could ever want to know or collect on podcast listening behavior. They have a really good engineering team over there at NPR, and they're doing some very interesting things. One project that I know of that they're doing is called Dovetail, and they're basically doing some interesting things with ads. So let's just say they're basically generating an MP3 on the fly. So when your podcast app goes to download, it will look at your IP address and then decide, based on your location, which ad to serve. So they have like maybe 4 or 5 kind of like ad clips, and then they'll splice it into different places inside of an MP3 of a podcast, and they'll serve it to you. And it's called Dovetail. Obviously, that comes from woodworking, when you're trying to put 2 pieces of wood together in a very strong, and it's a joint for furniture. But yeah, the idea is they're just trying to A/B test ads and try to optimize the ad for the listener. So that could be on zip code, right? They can take their IP address and then convert that into a zip code through US Census data, and from there, see what happens. But yeah, they had a very interesting talk at Podcast Movement about their engineering efforts at NPR.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting problem space, and given the fact that we're producing a podcast, one that's pretty close to home for us. So it's definitely good to see people continuing to innovate and try to solve some of the existing problems. And I think that Podbuzz is a pretty interesting offering in the space for being able to sort of control your reputation and get a broader sense of feedback and try and encourage people to leave reviews to make your podcast easier to find. So are there any other topics that you wanted to cover before we close out the show?
I don't think so.
Great. So for anybody who wants to follow you and keep up to date with what you're working on, what would be the best way for them to do that?
I would say on Twitter. So I don't really have a personal Twitter, but I do have one for Podbuzz. It's spelled Podbuzzz. That's 3 Z's. The reason is because Podbuzz with 2 Z's .com was $2,000, and adding an extra Z made it $12. So I chose the 3 Z's. So Podbuzz on Twitter. And yeah, that's probably the best place to reach me. You can also reach me at kyle@podbuzz.com. And I encourage you to sign up and just check it out if you're just interested in the service and how it works. And feel free to reach out.
Yeah, it's a pretty interesting product. I actually came across it while I was looking through some of the different WordPress plugins for podcasting and decided to give it a shot. And that's how we ended up with this interview. So thank you for taking the time out of your day to join us on that.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I wasn't sure if that WordPress plugin would ever result in anything, but it was a fun couple hours to hack it together.
So with that, I'll move us on into the picks. My pick this week is a band called Thank You Scientist that I discovered via Spotify. They're an interesting sort of mixed genre experimental musical group. They've got a lot of really interesting sounds to them, and they're pretty well composed and executed, so definitely recommend taking a look at them. And with that, I'll pass it to you, Chris.
Thanks, Tobias. I just have one pick this week. It is a movie called Hell or High Water with Jeff Bridges and a number of other lesser-known actors. I walked in thinking this was going to be an action film and kind of an entertaining romp, and it wasn't. It was actually a rather deep exploration of morality, the morality around capitalism versus poverty and justice. It was really interesting. I highly recommend it. Kyle, do you have any picks for us?
Yeah, I have a couple. The first one I have is it's a Udacity course. Actually, it's what they call a nano degree from Udacity. It's for learning how to become a self-driving car engineer. So I think it's a couple $100 a semester. But if you're really interested in getting into the space of self-driving cars, it's apparently all the rage right now, especially on Hacker News. So if you want to, join in that conversation and join in that industry, I would recommend checking out that self-driving car Udacity course. I have 2 podcasts, Startups for the Rest of Us, Zero to Scale. And the last thing I have would be a pretty neat service. It's a speech-to-text API called Speechmatics. They basically have a Python library that's very easy to use. You can pass it to MP3, and then it'll give you a really well done transcript that's also time aligned. So it'll actually tell you, at what point in time people were speaking, and it recognizes different speakers. So they have a pretty cool speaker recognition algorithm. And it's actually something I'm using in Podbuzz. I have a feature that will basically give you an instant transcript of your episode. And by the way, I have one of those for y'all at the end of this episode. I uploaded episode 74, and I'll send you the results after this.
That's actually something that I've been looking into a bit more recently. So thank you for pointing that one out. I'll have to check it out some more.
Yep.
All right. Well, thank you again for taking the time out of your day to join us and talk to us about Podbuzz and podcasting and some of the different challenges that go along with it. I think that it's made for a pretty interesting conversation, and I certainly got a few interesting bits and pieces out of it, so I hope everybody else did as well.
Thanks. Cheers.
All right. Have a good night.